Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Anti-European Union populist, nationalist parties, call them what you will. They have been on the march across Europe in recent years, and elections in May could see them make more gains. Is the European Union facing a threat from the inside? A very warm welcome from me, David Foster. They don't like at all what the European Union stands for. The parties I've just described are expected to make more gains in the forthcoming elections to the European Parliament, and it could give them more of a say in an institution that they loathe. So could the European Union be on the verge of a new, even less certain era?
The European Union is worried about an enemy within. Nationalist, anti-EU parties are projected to make big gains in next month's elections for the EU's Parliament. And it could pose a threat to the European project. Some estimates suggest a third of parliamentary seats could go over to Eurosceptics, giving them a much bigger say over EU laws. In the Netherlands, the far-right Forum for Democracy is now the biggest party in the upper house, after last week's regional voting. In France, Germany, Greece and elsewhere, nationalist parties have made unexpected gains in recent years. On top of that, intelligence agencies say Russia could be gearing up for a disinformation campaign to undermine the EU. With 300 million people eligible to vote and Europe at a political and social crossroads, the elections could be significant for the EU's future direction.
Please say that joining us from the European Parliament in Strasbourg, we have Mike Hookem, Deputy Leader of the UK Independence Party, UKIP, who is a member of the European Parliament for now. In the Roundtable studio, we have Denis Macshane, former UK Minister for Europe, also Nadibaidze from the Open Europe think tank, and Dr. Russell Foster, a lecturer in European politics at King's College, London. Starting off with you, first of all, Mike, strange to think, isn't it, that one day pretty soon, because of Brexit, you may well be out of a job, and you'll be delighted.
Absolutely. I mean, we've always said that we was the turkeys that voted for Christmas. I've worked for over 10 years to get Great Britain out of the European Union, and we thought we'd done that, and this Friday we was leaving. But obviously that's not going to happen now because of a terrible deal that Theresa May's brought back from the European Union. So it looks as though we're going to be stuck here for a bit longer.
With regard to your work to get Britain out of the European Union, in your time in Strasbourg, what do you think has changed? Why are you perhaps more sceptical now than you ever were? Why has it reinforced your beliefs that Britain's better off out?
Well, because the legislation that's coming through now is being ramped up. I mean, we're getting votes now that we're doing one at lunchtime, one at 6 o'clock. You know, we never used to do that. They're shoving as much through as they can, and their position has hardened. You know, what they're giving Great Britain at the moment is a punishment deal, and it's basically saying anybody else, any one of the other 27 member states who thinks about leaving the European Union, look at what we did to Great Britain. And, you know, this is how these people are dealing with us, and we're seeing it in the chamber now. But you know, I just think now that they're going to go for an extension to Article 15, and we will not be leaving, as was promised. I think it was 108 times by Theresa May in the Parliament that we would be leaving on Friday, and that's now not going to happen.
In terms of the broader picture across Europe as a whole, some of the predictions are that populist, if you like, or Eurosceptic parties are going to get 1/3 of the seats in the European Parliament. It's not just Britain, is it, which seems to have a problem with what's going on where you are?
No, it isn't. And I mean, people use this term populist. Well, it's terrible when you are a popular political party, as we are. And it's, you know, we are fighting for this, but we can see it right across Europe with other parties that are now fighting. Some are fighting to reform the European Union, which I don't think they will ever do, but some are going to be fighting to come out of the European Union. And I can see with these elections that's coming forward now, I can see lots and lots more Eurosceptic parties coming in, and I think it's going to be an absolute nightmare for Mr. Barnier and Junckers and Verhofstadt and Weber and all of these federalists, you know, you're the Europhiles, when all of these parties actually get into that plenary and sit there and take them to task.
You're right to say that it's not a homogenous group, is it? I mean, so many of these, if you want populist parties, have different agendas. Is there any one thing with regard to the European Union upon which you think they agree?
They all detest it. That's one thing that they all say. The European Union, the way it's going now, is wrong. It's wrong for national governments. We need to be able to, as a country, and I speak on behalf of Great Britain, that we need to be out of this, you know, and we need a sovereign parliament. Again, sovereign borders, and we need to be out of this. And I think that's right across the European Union. These other parties that are coming through all say they want more say in how their countries are controlled.
And that is your main objection. Are there others?
Main objections, basically, yeah, you know, how this place runs. I mean, I've fought for years to help the fishermen of Great Britain. The fishermen are absolutely devastated by the common fisheries policy. Many of those people have gone bankrupt. There will be many more in the next 2 years that will go bankrupt. This is our waters, British fish, caught by British fishermen, landed in British ports, processed in British factories and exported around the world. You know, this is the sort of thing we want. We want now to get back to the old days where it's British manufacturing, British exports, getting out there. And, you know, this is why we say a WTO deal would be very good for us. We want to be out there trading with the rest of the world and trading with Europe and the 27 member states. We've said this from the beginning. If they give us a tariff-free deal, a bilateral agreement between Great Britain and the European Union, we'd have been very happy with that, but they wouldn't do that. They refuse to do that. So, you know, we're having to fight these people to get out of this European Union.
Mike, we will be back with you a little bit later on, but let's bring it back to the studio. And is Mike right to suggest, Denis, as a former Minister for Europe, that it's okay, he outlines Britain's position, but is it the same with the Spanish populist movements, the Italian populist movements, you know, you could name a whole raft of different countries?
No, not at all. I completely agree with Mike. In 2 years' time, I think the damage will be far worse than he's indicating. I mean, Brexit is going to devastate our economy, and our fishermen will no longer be able to export the 70% of their catch to the EU. But that's the price we have to pay.
But we're not talking specifically about Britain.
Right, let's move on. It's much more varied. It's a bit like UKIP to some extent. 2014, they're the biggest party in the European Parliament. General election 2017, 1.8% of the vote. And you can see that all over Europe, where you have populist parties that surge. The one thing they all have in common now is they used to have, a couple of years ago, many of them, a commitment to hold a referendum on leaving Europe, and quite often a commitment to leave the euro. Brexit has killed that stone dead. I mean, Brexit, oddly enough, is a kind of glue that's putting Europe together again, even with lots of very different positions. I could go through lots of details. It is quite extraordinary. And very often when the populist parties become the establishment, like in Poland, for example, and we're now seeing most of the polls in Poland saying that the more pro-European opposition, it's actually called the European Coalition, will get the most votes in the European Parliament. So it goes up and down all the time.
Are we going to see, Russell, you first of all on this one, are we going to see a rise of particular populist nationalist parties of which many people are aware when it comes to European elections, such as Marine Le Pen? Are they going to make a real mark on what's going to happen within the next 10 years in Europe?
Well, Mike is right to point out that we need to be careful of using this term populist, because it's just become a term of abuse that increasingly means nothing. We will see a rise of Eurosceptic parties across Europe, depending on where in Europe. So the research I'm doing at King's College London is arguing that there are 3 European unions. We've got the Northwest Industrial Core, whose populations resent the amount of money they're paying to other countries. We've got the Mediterranean littoral, who are on the front lines of austerity and migration, and then what is awkwardly called the post-Soviet states. Now, in the Mediterranean, we'll see right-wing and left-wing Eurosceptic parties making gains in the elections. In the post-Soviet states, we'll see nationalist right-wing movements making gains. What unites them is not a contempt for Europe, but a concern, as Mike pointed out, that Europe is not working the way that it should be. And although they've got very, very different agendas, some favour some sort of a European alliance, some favour nationalism. Although they've got a lot of differences, what does unite them is that they think that the current system is broken and needs to be fixed.
And are they going to be able to work together?
Yes, they are. We can take an example from national elections. Take a look at Italy, where we've got the pretty far left, and not the far right, but towards the far right, working together in alliance because of their dislike of centrist liberalism. So we are going to see left Eurosceptics and right Eurosceptics sort of forming this unholy alliance against the centre.
And Anna, do you think, therefore, that we are seeing the beginning of the end of the EU as it is now, because there will be a united front, even if it is made up of a multitude of different positions and opinions, but they could come together to change the European Union as it is now?
I just don't really see that this populist cooperation as something that is an institutionalized or long-term process. Yes, they might cooperate, as we saw in Italy, but even in Italy, there remains several differences between Mr. Salvini and Di Maio on fiscal policy, for instance, and in regional elections, they are not in a coalition, so it might happen that populist parties could work on some issues, but it might mostly be ad hoc cooperation. We see them talking together, we see them meeting, the media is reporting on that, and so we have the feeling that there will be some kind of great populist wave, but it's not necessarily something cohesive.
Is anybody listening at the centre of all of this to these complaints?
To the, you mean?
Well, these groups are complaining about what they see as an unfair, unjust and unbalanced system run by certain people. Are those certain people or organizations listening to the complaints as they come?
I have the feeling that some of them are listening, and Mr. Macron, for instance, he's not in the EU institutions, but he feels that
Pivotal.
Yes, I mean, it's going to be, it's not as if it's going to be a battle between two, the pro-EU camp and the populist camp. Both of these camps are divided, and it's not a fair way to portray this election as divided between these two camps. But others will try to address people's concerns in order to also address the rise of populist parties.
Okay, well,
Well, very much. I mean, of course Macron's listening. He's had mass demonstrations in the streets of Paris and other towns since the end of November.
But answer me this, is that because the demonstrators, the Gilets jaunes, hate his policies in France, or they hate what the European Union is doing?
Marine Le Pen is supporting them to attack Macron. Her position is anti-European. Now, it's interesting that since those protests started, and Marine Le Pen was right in there, so was a guy called Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who heads the hard left party, les Gilets jaunes against Europe. In both cases, her party and the Mélenchon party have declined in popularity, and Macron now is clearly ahead, not dramatically ahead, and that's what we're seeing, I think, a little bit all over Europe. I completely agree with Nadia. The idea that in Italy, that's an alliance against nature, and the idea, believe me, this idea there's going to be 235 hard right anti-European MEPs, I don't know where that figure comes from, it's nonsense. The vast majority, if you add together the centre-right, centre-left, Liberals, Greens, left parties, and some populist parties, you're talking about over 500 MEPs. The rest, yes, but they're split between those who love Putin, those who hate Putin, those who want the EU to transfer far more money to them, those who want, like in Italy, the northern countries to take their immigrants and refugees and their right-wing friends in Austria and Germany say, you must be joking, keep them in Italy. So it's quite incoherent, all of this.
Let me interrupt for a moment, Denis, if I may. And Mike, I will come to you in just a second, but I want to put it to you first of all, Russell, that I wonder if, as I said to Denis, the people who are complaining on the streets and at the ballot box are complaining about policies within their own country, or whether they're complaining about the European Union.
Well, this is precisely the problem, that the European Union ends up getting blamed for things that the EU is not responsible for, and in some cases, things that the EU actively tries to help. So if we take, say, Northern England or Eastern Germany, where deindustrialisation has been had a huge impact on people's lives, the EU Development Fund has worked towards alleviating that, and yet the EU still gets blamed for global changes or national failures. You were asking earlier as to whether people in the centre of Brussels are listening. I think they are, but they'll find it really, really difficult to respond. The EU is incredibly difficult to reform. It does seem to survive every crisis that comes its way, but it's really difficult to reform. And as national governments continue to face problems, crises, Europe will still get blamed for these. So it largely doesn't matter what Europe does, it will become a scapegoat.
And I'll come back to you in a little while, but Mike, we've left you alone for too long in a place that you don't really want to be left alone in. You'll be able to leave fairly soon. Tell me about the reforms as suggested by Russell. The people are perhaps listening at last. Do you hear that?
No, the European Union, their fault has always been that they don't listen. They are right and everybody else is wrong. If when David Cameron had come over here in the first place and tried to get some reform from these people, if he'd come back with something, I don't believe the 2016 referendum would have occurred. But he came back with nothing because these people wouldn't listen to him, and they never listen. And when they are told, they just turn a deaf ear. And these people need to start listening. And we're seeing the yellow vests in France campaigning against high fuel prices and all the rest of it. And that now has been taken over by the far left, and it's now they're now taking over and destroying property and destroying jobs and everything else. But these people are not listening to this, and people are going to start demonstrating right across Europe, and I can see they're demonstrating in Great Britain as well. Europe will never listen, the EU will never listen, because they just do not think that they are wrong.
If you think these disparate groups are all intent on perhaps bringing down the European Union, and perhaps that they might be succeeding in the first steps of that, do you see any dangers in the EU crumbling?
No, I think they'll go back to national governments, sovereign governments, and we'll get back to being proud of who you are, whether you're French, German, whatever you are, and being proud of it. I'm not a European. I'm an Englishman, and I'm a Yorkshireman. That's what I'm proud of being. Never ever call me a European. I am not.
Thank you very much, Mike. Back to you for the end of the programme. Anna, did we not see the dangers of not having a united Europe, if you want, in the federal sense, with two world wars in the 20th century?
I mean,
Mike says there is no danger. Go back to simple sovereignty, which is nationalism, which is what led us to what happened in 1914 and 1939.
Well, yeah, but if we look at public surveys across Europe, people do feel European, and they can feel both German, French, and Irish and European. I think that's, if we look at the public opinion, that's not something that risks collapsing. I mean, it's not as big as we're just...
Do you think people feel as much European as they do, let's say, Spanish, French, Belgian, Dutch?
Well, in many countries, the positive opinion of the European Union has increased in recent months and perhaps years. People feel like they actually benefit, that they gain something from the EU. I don't really see how such an institutionalized process can just reveal
So let me ask you, Russell, we'll let you in just a second. With the rise of whatever you want to call them, parties, yeah? These new groups of parties that are disaffected with the European Union, it's a long way of putting it, but we'll live with that. And if they get a hold in the European Parliament, what difference is it going to make?
Well, what kind of hold can they get? I mean, right now the polls say around 25%. That's not enough to really block legislation. It might, if they get more than a third, which is I think is exaggerated, they might make the legislative process a bit more cumbersome and a bit more complicated. But that will also depend on whether perhaps the center-right and center-left main political groups will be divided as well. But if they if they keep, if they are not divided, then I don't really see how the populist, or how do you call it?
So it's fractured and fractious at the same time.
It is, and this is the way that Europe has always been. And although the European Union does go from one crisis to another, it always survives. On the point of identity, it seems there's a curious phenomenon that the people who have the strongest European identity are the ones who are outside of it. Ukrainians who want to join and British Remainers who want to stay. You don't see people massing on the streets of Barcelona or Milan painting their faces blue and shouting never going to give you up. So it is possible to have this dual identity. On the point of the so-called populists in the European Parliament, there's two things to remember. First, they don't need to form a united bloc. They can easily hamstring legislation in the new Parliament, especially depending on who the new commissioner is after Jean-Claude Juncker. The second point, as Denis pointed out, is that Brexit has shown Eurosceptic movements that leaving the EU is very difficult and comes with a lot of problems. What we're seeing in Eurosceptic movements across the EU now is not that they want to leave the EU, but that they want to take over the EU's apparatus and turn it towards their philosophies and their advantage. So not leaving, but gaining control.
Do you think the difficulties, Denis, that Britain has faced in trying to leave the European Union will invigorate those who already felt that it was something they didn't want to be part of, or will it perhaps put them off? In other words, will we see more moves to get out of the European Union because of this, or is it just going to die?
Well, Brexit has killed what classic leave the European Union ideology, stone dead. And the last party that believed in it, wanted a referendum, was the Swedish Left Party, former communist Stalinist party. They've just dropped that from their manifesto. I mean, Brexit, David Cameron, all the guys who believe passionately in amputating Britain from Europe have actually done the EU an enormous service. The biggest demonstration in Europe this century was, of course, on Saturday, with 1 million marching in the streets of London. And I have to say, President Macron was paying far more attention to a few thousand loudmouths, perhaps because they throw stones and attack Jews and loot, than Mrs May or anybody in the political class is paying to 1 million fellow Brits from all over the UK, saying, what are we doing leaving the European Union?
Can we put that point to Mike? I saw you shaking your head, Mike, but what Denis is saying is, in fact, the work of people such as yourself and your independence party has actually had the opposite effect than it would have wanted in the rest of Europe.
Well, it's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that right across Europe, these parties are coming forward and saying that, we want what you've fought for, and we're going to do exactly the same. And when these people do get into this parliament, in July when the next parliament starts, and there'll be all these new parties in there, all these people that say some want to reform, some want to leave. They are going to have to form a huge group, because the rules that these people are bringing in now, the European Union are bringing in now, are going to make sure that the small parties, such as my own party, will not have a voice in this place. This is what we are fighting against. This is not an undemocratic building. This is anti-democratic. This is anti-democracy. And they are bringing rules in to make sure that our voice is not heard and that they shut us down. So we're going to have to form a huge group, a super group is what they're calling it, between all of these different parties, so that we've got a voice in that plenary when we come to vote and when we come to speak. And that is what these people are about, and that is why we, as a party, and many others, want to be shut of this place and want to be out of it.
Perhaps time to give the European Union
what's going to be coming through.
Perhaps time to give the European Union a bit longer. It took a long time to set up the federal system in the United States, and an awful lot of lives were lost, but it got there in the end. Perhaps you're trying to knock it down a bit too soon, Mike.
Well, we try to be truthful. I ain't bothered what happens with this place. If it carries on after we leave, that's okay by me. We came in as a party to tell the people exactly what goes on in this building, and we won that referendum. It was UKIP that won the referendum in 2016. Without us, they would not have had that referendum. So we went in there and we said we will work from within to get Great Britain out of the European Union. That's all we want. If after that this whole project collapses, well, so be it. But if it carries on, so be it.
Okay,
What we
Mike,
want,
we're going to have to
what
say
I want,
goodbye.
what my party want, and what we are focusing on.
We're going to have to
is
say
getting
goodbye.
Great Britain
Perhaps
out
it's
of
going to
the
be the
European
last
Union.
time that we talk to you in that place, but you're always welcome to come into our studios and debate
I
it
very
further.
much doubt it.
So Denis says thank you very. Denis says he thinks it's killed the idea of independence from an awful lot and the rise of nationalism. Is that something we've got to be pretty quick on this? Is it something with which you agree, Russell?
Nationalism is still going to be an issue in Europe. I mean, it's a little bit of an arrogant belief to think that the British alone can break the European project. We've always been the most reluctant member of Europe. When we go, there's still going to be a European Union after we leave.
Understand that, but have the difficulties of Britain leaving killed the idea of further independence movements wanting to do the same thing? In other words, the rise of nationalism, it may be populist, but it's not going to get anywhere.
Oh, I agree. Leaving the EU is just, as we saw with Brexit, it's just not a viable option, or leaving the euro. No major populist party is advocating either of those options.
Okay, so we're going to see some changes. We're going to see more populist, Eurosceptic MEPs, but we're not going to see them achieving very much in terms of their ultimate desires if they happen to be independence-minded. Mike, thank you very much indeed. I know that's not your thought, but that is the thought of the panel here. We appreciate your time from Strasbourg, and from Denis, from Anna, and from Russell, and from me. Thank you very much indeed for watching. It is time for us to leave, if only it were that easy in every sense. Goodbye for now.